Hi people, today is the 7th of July 2025 and we mark exactly 20 years since the London bombings of July the 7th, 2005, commonly known in the UK as 7/7 or the 7/7 attacks. I want to look at this from a few perspectives, firstly my own recollections, also the wider implications of the event. Um, this was a major terrorist attack, series of coordinated bombings in central London, predominantly in the London Underground, but also including a bus at Tavistock Square. And the underground stations that were targeted was Edgware Road, Aldgate East, and Russell Square. Sometimes that's called the King's Cross attack because it also took place near King's Cross Terminus. Um, so this was a major incident. 784 people injured, 52 people killed, plus four suicide bombers. So a major incident. To put that in context, that does rank as London's worst terrorist attack, England's worst terrorist attack, and one of the worst in the UK. The Lockerbie bombing of 1988 had more fatalities, so that's classed as Britain's worst terrorist attack. But this was certainly something we had never seen before. London was no stranger to terrorism. Throughout the Troubles, there'd been the IRA's mainland campaign, and that had caused some fatalities in London, but not on the sort of scale that we saw in 2005. There'd also been some violent incidents related to the Middle East conflict prior to that date, but this was on a different scale. Um, I think it was shocking, but not entirely surprising, because what we'd seen since September 11th was a series of Al Qaeda linked attacks. The year before, of course, in Madrid, at a torture station, there was a absolute carnage, 191 people killed. So I don't think it was overly surprising when London was hit. Still shocking. That week was a very big week, actually, generally. The G8 summit was being held, G8 as it still then was, being held at Glen Eagles in Scotland. Tony Blair was the host. And I remember him cutting into the meeting and explaining to other world leaders what had happened and making an announcement and then flying back to London. Um, it was also the week that London won the Olympic bid from Paris, over Paris, I should say. Um, and I was at the Live 8 concerts, the Live 8 concert, I should say. But that was a series of concerts held in five cities around the world. The others were Philadelphia, Tokyo, Berlin, and I think Johannesburg. They were much like the Live Aid concerts of 1985, um, charity relief concerts, except this time it wasn't to raise money, it was to raise awareness of the Make Poverty History campaign. So there was these big events going on in London and the UK at the time. I remember that was a very busy week. Um, I was at the Live 8 concert. I was one of the lucky people who got a text message and invite me to go. Um, I went by myself, which was not ideal. Would have preferred company, but I remember that I'd just been awake all night and I was on the train all day and then throughout the concert. Some of the most famous people in the world were there. Bill Gates, Brad Pitt, Elton John, um, a lot of big acts at the time. It was a huge event, but because all the hostels in central London were booked up, I couldn't get someone to sleep, so I literally slept rough that night. I think it was the 2nd of July. Um, and I slept on the concourse of King's Cross Station. A few days later, it was targeted. King's Cross is a station, of course, that has a history. There was a 1987 fire, and there was also a train accident in the 1940s. So that's a station that has a bit of a history. Um, I was back in Sunderland at the time the bombings happened, so I was following you throughout the day. And it was initially all the reports were power failures on the London Underground. Then, as there were reports of explosions coming in, I think it wasn't too long before media pundits started saying this is a possible terrorist attack. And then it was a coordinated series of bombings. Um, and what we know is that the suicide bombers were four young Muslim men from the Leeds area who'd been radicalized as Islamists affiliated to Al Qaeda. But the shocking thing was they were British citizens of Pakistani descent, but nevertheless British citizens. Um, which is different from some other terrorist attacks which have been perpetrated by foreign jihadists. That was characteristic of the London bombings. It was, I won't say unique, but notable. Since then, of course, Europe and Britain have experienced numerous Islamist atrocities. Manchester, more attacks in London throughout 2017. Paris, of course, numerous times. Berlin, Nice, Barcelona. So this is not something that this continent is a stranger to. And of course, throughout the Middle East and North Africa and other parts of the world, there has also been Islamist carnage. Um, I don't want to get too much into the politics of it, but I think it would be remiss of me not to mention something, given the nature of this channel. So I still believe that there is denialism about the reality of pan Islamist extremism. And that comes, I think, mainly from two camps. It comes from Muslims who are defensive, who don't want to admit that there is actually violent extremism in the midst. Because the narrative is always, it's got nothing to do with Islam. And we always hear about Islamophobia now. I want to be very clear on this point. I always condemn anti Muslim bigotry. It's wrong to tar everyone with the same brush. There were Muslim victims that day. I'm watching a series on Netflix now, actually, and there was a young guy who was a Muslim and he was badly injured in one of the attacks. And the very next day, I do think it was inappropriate. One of the news anchors immediately said, "How does it feel to be a Muslim at this time?" And perhaps the question was relevant, but it was a bit insensitive to someone who'd just seen people killed in a terrorist attack. To expect him to somehow be a spokesperson for the Muslim community. So I do have sympathy with any Muslim who felt that they were tarred with the same brush. And we have had hate crimes directed at Muslims. I will always condemn that. It's a disgrace. There have also been terrorist attacks aimed at the Muslim community. The attack at Finsbury Park Mosque and the murder of an elderly gentleman in Birmingham by a white supremacist in 2013. So there has been attacks against Muslims, and that happened after 7/7. But I have a short patience with the argument it's got nothing to do with Islam. I don't think you can tackle an ideology without recognizing the reality of it. Saying it's just terrorism is vague. The other group, like I say, I think too many Muslims continue to be in denial about this and defensive about it. The other group is the political left. And for them, it's political correctness. We better not say it's an Islamist attack. That would be Islamophobic. It would be discriminating against Muslims. I don't think it is. I would argue Muslims are also victims of pan Islamism. So I don't think talking about pan Islamism and the fact it is a threat and the need to counter it can be described as Islamophobic. That's absurd. The government imposed a prevent terrorism program, and the political left and so-called Muslim faith groups have constantly attacked that. My question to them is, if you are criticizing methods, efforts to counter terrorism, what are you doing yourself to counter terrorism? It's no good simply condemning extremism. It's not good enough to say this terrorist carnage has happened or we condemn terrorism. I don't think that's good enough. I think Muslim community leaders need to show that they're proactive in expelling Islamists, for example, from a local mosque, um, and showing that they are working with the police. There's too much of a victimhood narrative going on now. Like I say, I am very sympathetic to Muslims who genuinely have been targeted, but I also think there's a false victimhood narrative, which is to say that Muslims are under attack by the British state. I do not think that is true at all. Every Home Secretary and Prime Minister has been at pains to say this is not about Muslims. Indeed, after September 11th, George W. Bush said this isn't about Islam. So I think it's time that the Muslim community was honest that there is a problem of Islamic extremism. And I find it unfortunate that 20 years after our worst terrorist attack, at least in London, there is still this attitude of, I mean, The Guardian today was leading on that. About how Muslims, it's a dangerous atmosphere and they feel under threat. I'm okay with that sort of thing being covered, but why make that the main headline on the 20th anniversary of 7/7? You know, I typed that into Google and it's the first thing that came up. Um, One of the victims, a man who lost both legs, he was at the bombing at Russell Square tube station. He said he still sees suicide bombers, so that sort of PTSD still has an effect 20 years later. I'm not sure if we will experience that sort of terrorism on the London Underground again, although it can never be 100% foolproof. There have been measures brought in. Um, the fact that we haven't had a major attack on the London Underground since then is a testament, I think, to the security services. And, you know, I don't think they get enough credit, actually. Every day that there isn't a terrorist attack is a day that they've done their job. Unfortunately, when there is a terrorist attack, it gets a lot of headlines, which is perhaps what terrorists want. It's a difficult one because, on one hand, you don't want to give terrorists the oxygen of publicity. On the other hand, if six civilians are killed by some maniac who's driven a car at them, can't say. I mean, that is news. It is news by definition. Um, Of course, Islamic extremism is not the only form of terrorism. We have had far right extremism as well. The man who murdered Joe Cox, for instance. There are violent far right groups out there. I don't believe it's a situation of one justifies the other. I don't think it should be a competition. I think they're both bad news. And anyone that thinks the far right is harmless should remember the Soho nail bombing. Three killed and I believe hundreds were wounded in that attack. So it's right that the security services also focus on far right extremism. But I have a big problem with some of the political correctness and failure to be honest about pan Islamist extremism that we still see around us. Now, I'm going to wrap this up soon. But my own recollections of the event, like I say, are that I was in London at the time. I don't want to be too cliche. Like I remember, I was there. I wasn't, not directly, but I was in London that week. And the thing about a city like London, it's always going to be a target. It's not just a capital city, but it's one of the world's most important cities. A major financial center. It's an alpha world city by the definition of global cities. Only New York City and a couple of others really rival London for importance. So London will always be a target, unfortunately. I think with the best will in the world, it's almost impossible to absolutely prevent terrorism. But I do think there is a strong argument with immigration that people who are hostile to this country do not belong here. And I think the left need to wake up with that. I'm not anti-immigration, actually. I have a balanced approach to that, but I do think that it's it's a no-brainer, right? That if someone is hostile to this country, they should not be here. And as for those who are radicalized domestically, um, my point to faith leaders would be you can constantly criticize prevent, even though it targets the far right as well. My question to you is okay, you think that's bad? What's your solution? What do you suggest for counter radicalization? What are you doing about this problem? Now, to be fair, there have been mosques that have expelled extremists, there have been mosques that have taken action. There are Muslims who are honest about the problem, but there are still too many people who are in denial about this. And I loathe the way that both the political left and some reactionary Muslims use this term Islamophobia to silence debate. It's a cowardly, pathetic term. When we talk about hate crimes against Muslims, I think anti-Muslim bigotry is a reasonable term. I do not like the term Islamophobia because I believe it's a misnomer. I don't think it's an irrational phobia to be concerned about Islamic extremism. Violent Wahhabist jihadism is something to be concerned about. Now, of course, we should put it into context. The actual chances of being killed in any terrorist attack are very, very low. This is not something that happens every day. It is not, it's not that frequent. So it is important that we don't live our lives governed by counter-terrorist measures. But counter-terrorist measures are unfortunately necessary. Um, so that's what I take away from this. My thoughts are with the victims because they're still dealing with this. Um, I believe that pan Islamism is real. It has to be spoken about, it has to be countered. I believe that Muslim community, they just have to be honest about it instead of always getting defensive and claiming it's nothing to do with Islam. I appreciate it's not their version of Islam. It's not what they want to see. They can't deny that the London bombers were young Muslim men. That's just a reality. It's a little bit like the political correctness around the grooming gangs being overwhelmingly British, Pakistani males. That's just a reality. Um, so I believe that where there is a problem, it has to be spoken about candidly. Um, I give the security services a lot of credit. Yes, sometimes mistakes are made. What happened with John Charles de Menezes was awful, an innocent Brazilian man shot dead. But counterterrorism police are an incredibly difficult job, and I think people do need to be understanding that that job involves keeping people alive. It involves preventing these sort of things happening. We haven't had a terrorist attack with the exception of Manchester on that sort of scale since. But in London, it's been there hasn't been an attack on the underground, but there has been vehicle attacks, Westminster Bridge, London Bridge. So terrorists will do what they can to cause mayhem. Um, I've spoke about Islamist extremism. There is also a problem with far right extremism. Quite frankly, I wouldn't rule out eco extremism. They say they're peaceful, but you know, any sort of ideology that feels it's legitimate to target the public has to be taken seriously. Now, I'll be talking about Palestine action, but that's for another video. This one, I'm just focusing on 7/7. That's my thoughts on it. If you're a British Muslim, I'm not against you. I have no problem with Muslims, generally speaking, who are just going about their lives. But I do say this line, it's got nothing to do with Islam, is actually an insult to victims of Islamism. Be honest about the problem. Just like white people need to be honest about white supremacy, Muslims have to be honest about Islamic extremism. And there's too much defensiveness, in my opinion, still 20 years on. Um, Too many politicians are reluctant to say the words Islamist extremism. And what I find a bit galling about the left, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, for example, would be very quick to talk about far right extremism, but he would then say, if we have an Islamist attack, he would just regurgitate the narrative that's got nothing to do with Islam. Well, actually, Islamic extremism has got something to do with Islam. Let's be honest about it.